It's been 3 days since the last royal correction, and you've just started to heal. Well, sort of. The bruises are turning that lovely shade of purple you're sure will be a fashion trend someday. Your back still feels like it's made of spaghetti, but hey, at least you're not walking like a full-on pretzel anymore. Just when you think you might get a break, you hear it. That sound. The royal summons. It's time for another whipping. Apparently, Prince Douchebag has made yet another small mistake. Oh, he spilled some wine on the royal robes. Or maybe he threw a tantrum because the peasants didn't bow low enough for his liking. Whatever the reason, it's your back that's about to feel the brunt of his royal incompetence. You'd love to ask why you always have to be the one to take the hit. But why bother? It's not like anyone cares. You've basically become the kingdom's emotional punching bag. And honestly, at this point, you're considering applying for disability because of royal-induced trauma. So, why in the world would anyone want to be a whipping boy? Well, surprise. It's not exactly a prestigious job by choice. See, the logic behind this bizarre system was that the prince, future ruler of the kingdom, was too precious to be punished. Because punishing royalty is treason, apparently. But someone needed to be punished, so the genius idea was born. Let's beat up an innocent kid who'll take the blame for every royal screw-up. The hope was that the prince would feel guilty watching you get whipped, and maybe he'd shape up. Spoiler alert, most princes just thought it was hilarious. You're thinking, hey, life in the castle sounds pretty sweet. But then you meet the prince, already a tiny tyrant, like a walking, talking, spoiled, child-sized dictator. The first thing he says to you is, "Do you like being hit?" Which would be a red flag if you weren't so naive. 10 minutes later, after he skips a lesson, you're bent over in front of a tutor, getting whipped for something he did. Congrats on your first lesson in medieval disappointment. Okay, there are a couple of perks to this job. Sure, you get to live in a fancy castle, eat food that isn't just stale bread, and even get some fancy clothes. But here's the kicker. None of that matters when your entire purpose is to be the prince's punching bag. Want to study? Sure, you're right there in the royal lessons, but you're probably too busy bleeding from your latest learning experience to care. Oh, and don't get attached to the idea of friendship, because that's just another word for sucker. The prince isn't your friend. He's a brat who knows you'll suffer for his mistakes. Let's take a moment to talk about the prince. This isn't just a kid with a crown. This is the spoiled brat supreme. He's never heard the word no, and his idea of fun is tormenting you because, well, why not? He's got no real consequences for his actions. Why? Because you're the consequence. If he feels like throwing a tantrum or acting out, guess who's going to pay for it? That's right. You get to be the one who's punished while he gets to sit there in his fancy little chair, probably laughing at you. At home, your parents are busy bragging about how their kid is working in the castle with the prince. Sure, that sounds nice in theory, but when your entire village sees you limping back home, bruised and battered, that royal job loses its sheen real quick. Your parents try to pretend like everything's fine, but the neighbors? They're already whispering, "Isn't that the kid who gets whipped for every royal tantrum?" Yep, that's you. The public face of royal incompetence. Not exactly what they had in mind when they told the town you were living the dream. Being a whipping boy wasn't exactly a job that one could just clock out of at the end of the day. You were essentially bound by fate, or in this case, royal decree, and you had no say in the matter. Once you were chosen, you were in it for the long haul, or at least until the prince grew out of his tantrum phase. So could you quit? Maybe in theory, but in practice? You'd probably end up being branded a traitor or run out of town, and no one's got time for that when your life's already a one-way ticket to pain. Plus, where would you go? Not like you could just pop into the local tavern and say, "I'll take a pint and a nice, quiet life. Please?" Escape is a tempting thought, but let's face it. How realistic is it to escape a situation where your literal job is to stand still while someone whacks you with a switch? The answer, not very. The life of a whipping boy wasn't exactly one filled with freedom. You could try to run, but the royal guards weren't exactly known for their laissez-faire attitudes toward runaway servants. Plus, where were you going to hide? Sure, you could flee the castle, but eventually, someone would be like, "Oh, you're the kid who gets beaten for the prince's mistakes, right?" And before you know it, you'd be back in the same cycle of abuse. The best escape plan you could realistically hope for was for the prince to grow up, start behaving, and eventually let go of his need for a human stress ball. In short, your best bet was to endure and hope that one day the whippings would stop, not exactly a grand escape plan. Let's talk about the future. When the prince grows up, does the whipping boy get a sweet promotion? Maybe a raise? A thank you card? No, and definitely no. If you're lucky, the prince matures and stops being a total nightmare. If not, well, you're stuck in his court, probably being humiliated for the rest of your life, maybe as his personal jester, which is a fun title but not much of a career advancement. Either way, you're stuck in a system designed to break you mentally, physically, and emotionally. Add in the fact that your job is based on the whims of a spoiled prince who probably doesn't even remember your name after a few years. And yeah, it sucks. As much as we all wish this horrifying tradition could have ended with some epic rebellion or dramatic plot twist, the truth is, it died out gradually as royal life and child rearing evolved. The whipping boy system had its heyday during the Tudor and Stuart periods in England, where it was used as a way to teach young princes lessons. But by the 17th century, society was starting to rethink the whole concept of child punishment. With the rise of more progressive ideas around discipline, including the belief that kids should be taught with kindness and understanding, imagine. The idea of using a child as a scapegoat for royal misdeeds eventually fell out of favor. Plus, the concept of actually raising a prince to be a responsible leader became a bit more popular. Imagine that. A prince who can manage his own actions without relying on someone else to take the fall for him. By the 18th century, the job of the whipping boy was officially obsolete, and the poor kids who had been living that miserable existence could finally breathe a sigh of relief, assuming they had any breath left after all those beatings.